Imagine you've just exited your local supermarket, strolling through the automatic doors into the warm summer air. You're surrounded by the sweet smell of freshly cut grass and blooming honeysuckle. But wait, what's that? A cloying stench of stale waste and decay assaults your nostrils. And there she is, a peasant woman shopping for provisions. Welcome to the stinky world of medieval women. Today we're answering the question, what did medieval women smell like? If you were an average medieval European woman, chances are you smelled like, well, nothing much. Because when it came to bathing, you either had the money to make yourself smell good, or you didn't. If you belonged to the upper classes, your perfume was a status symbol, and you weren't shy about dousing yourself in the finest scents. While commoners were often too poor to buy perfume, let alone bathe, medieval women from all walks of life believed that water opened the pores to disease. This was because they believed that the body's pores were connected to the blood vessels. So if you bathed, you risked getting an illness through your skin. As a result, most women took a bath about as often as you brush your teeth, which is to say never, or at least only when they absolutely had to. The French Queen Isabella of Bavaria apparently went so long without bathing that people started to notice. When the royal court was invited to the wedding of King Edward I and Eleanor of Castile in 1254, Queen Isabella decided the journey would be a good chance to see her subjects. So she took a stage, yes, a traveling throne, and toured the countryside. That is, according to chronicler Jean Fauvart, who wrote that the queen went everywhere in her litter and would not go on foot. She washed herself only twice during the entire trip. Yikes. So how did women clean themselves if they didn't bathe? Well, they used a cloth to wipe themselves with water that might have been scented with vinegar or rosewater. But the real star of the show was urine. That's because urine was thought to help prevent infections and was commonly used in cleaning, especially for women who were menstruating. Urine was considered safer than water since it was distilled by the human body, and apparently no one thought it was gross to use. One medieval recipe for cleaning calls for mixing urine with a woman's excrement, though we don't recommend trying that one at home. While the rich had more resources to cover up their smells, the poor just kind of smelled. For the wealthy, perfumery was a luxury in itself, but essential oils were often mixed with other ingredients, such as crushed flowers, to make them last longer. Some women even powdered themselves with scented talc, which also helped absorb moisture. These ladies wanted to smell as sweet as possible, but also needed something to combat the natural musk of their bodies. Musk is produced by specialized glands on mammals, and humans are mammals, which means that even today you can get rid of it with some serious scrubbing. But in the Middle Ages, they didn't know that. So women of the upper classes tried to cover up their musk by any means necessary. For the not-so-upper classes, hygiene meant scrubbing with a rough cloth once a week, if then. So their musk was a bit harder to tame. Not that they'd want to. If you smelled too clean, people would think you were a witch. After all, witches were rumored to smell like flowers, so you'd want to avoid that. Whether they smelled sweet or stank, one thing is for sure, medieval women knew how to make an entrance. Now watch. What actually killed more people in the Middle Ages, rats or bacteria? Or check out what did medieval men smell like? I don't know about you, but I have a love-hate relationship with my body hair. I mean, sometimes I want to slap it, other times I want to stroke it, but either way I have a lot of it. And I'm pretty sure that this is going to be the very first time in human history that someone has ever said, "Geez, I wish I had less of it." Hi, I'm here to introduce you to Life Noggin. Today we are taking a trip back to the Middle Ages because medieval women did not have the same body hair removal options that we do today. In fact, it was extremely rare for women to remove any of their body hair at all. And there were very good reasons for this. The main one being that doing so was incredibly difficult and often dangerous. These days, heading to the salon or doing it yourself at home, it's all a matter of grabbing a razor and making a few strokes. But back in the Middle Ages, if you wanted to remove unwanted hair, you really only had two options. You could pluck it or you could burn it off. Shaving was an option, but it wasn't common because the tools used were both costly and risky. The sharp blades could cut or nick the skin easily, and when you in a time period where antibiotics are uninvented yet, A small cut can turn into a life-threatening infection really quickly. Plus, a razor was expensive. They cost around 5 shillings a piece, and the average laborer's wage was about 3 shillings a day. So you might be thinking, well, maybe those who had the extra money to spend on razors were doing the deed. But you would be wrong. In most cases, women weren't shaving their legs, underarms, or any other body parts simply because they didn't need to. Society did not expect them to. Women were expected to be married, and the hair on their body was considered a sign of fertility. More hair meant more children you could have. So instead of removing it, women would enhance their natural beauty, or so they thought, by adorning their heads with more hair. During the medieval period, women would often wear a wimple, which was a type of veil that covered the head and neck. They would also wear elaborate hairstyles, sometimes using false hair or even a hood to make it look bigger. In art and literature, women are often depicted with big, full-bodied wigs. And while these may seem itchy and uncomfortable to us, women actually enjoyed them because they were a status symbol. The bigger and more elaborate the hair, the higher the social status of the wearer. And with no time limits on how long you could wear them, unlike, say, a shower cap, medieval women could keep their hair as big as they wanted. But what about women who wanted to remove their hair? You know, the women who didn't want to be a walking fertility statue? Well, they had options, sort of. There was no such thing as a bikini wax or laser hair removal back then, so women had to get creative. Some would pluck their eyebrows or even shave their foreheads to make themselves look more angelic. Yep, you heard that right, foreheads. While we think of smooth, shaven foreheads as being a bit odd today, this was actually a beauty standard back then. Now, before you ask, no, there was no such thing as a forehead in the Old English language. The word forehead comes from the Old French forsvang, which means front part of the head. So you can imagine how the people of the time would have referred to the area above their eyes. A clear indicator that someone was getting a bit too creative with their translations. Either way, women who wanted to shave their foreheads would likely use a blunt instrument like a piece of flint to scrape away the hair. Talk about a pain in the ass. Other women used bizarre mixtures of burnt lime, vinegar, and cat fat to remove their unwanted hair. Or they'd deboil a resinous substance called myrrh in wine and use the resulting thick paste as a depilatory. And let's not forget about wax. Hot tree sap was often boiled and then used to cover small patches of unwanted hair. Once it cooled, it would harden into a solid mass, and when removed, take the hairs with it. This would have been a terrifying experience, as tree sap is sticky, flammable, and when heated, it would have resembled hot, gooey caramel more than anything else. Imagine pulling that off without modern pain relief. Ouch. As you can see, women had few options when it came to removing unwanted hair. Most chose to embrace their body hair as a sign of health and fertility. And to those few who didn't, we salute you for braving the depilatory, the hot wax, and the straight razors. Now watch. Why did medieval men put their balls in a sling? Or check out? Periods are kind of a pain in the ass, but at least you've got options when it comes to dealing with them. You can pop a painkiller, slip in a tampon, or just wear a decent pair of underwear to avoid any embarrassing leaks. But it wasn't so easy for women in the medieval period. Menstruation in the Middle Ages was an absolute disaster, which might explain why some people today still feel a little queasy about the subject. Forget modern conveniences like tampons or sanitary pads. Those wouldn't become widely available for many centuries. Medieval women had to make do with whatever materials were handy, like rags or moss or sheep's wool. Sometimes they used nothing at all, which is where the song lyric on the rag comes from. The cloths they did use were often washed, but not very thoroughly. They were then dried in the sun if possible and reused until they fell apart. It's no wonder that the risk of infection was through the roof. And if a woman couldn't afford supplies, she might just free bleed under her layers of skirts. And speaking of undergarments, don't get comfy because there were none. In the Middle Ages, women did not wear underwear because knickers weren't a thing yet. So things got pretty messy. And we haven't even mentioned the stench yet. For women who used unwashed rags or other natural materials, forget about sweet dreams. Your bedfellow will likely be a mouse or a beetle. Since lice and fleas love nothing more than a good soak in human blood, But this wasn't just a physical problem. Medical science believed that periods were evil, bad blood that needed to escape the body, a theory popularized by Hippocrates around 400 BC and still believed in the Middle Ages. This belief made menstruation something to be ashamed of, especially since women were apparently bleeding to death every month. According to one estimate, women suffered 2,000 years of menstrual stigma after that. And it would have been worse if you were a queen or other high-ranking female who had to pretend that everything was fine while secretly drowning in blood. To top it all off, women weren't allowed near religious spaces when they were menstruating. The church considered menstruation to be a form of ritual impurity. After all, how could they handle holy bread when they were bleeding so much? So women would sneak into churches and mass anyway and bleed on relics to get holy healing. But that was about their only option. Nobody wanted to talk about periods. Even the most intimate details of a woman's life were supposed to be kept secret. And a husband could take his wife to court if she spoke too freely about her own body. Cramps were also just part of the experience. Doctors did recommend walking to help the pain pass, along with praying to God for relief. Like he's got nothing better to do. If you were rich, you might visit a spa or take a bath in cold water and herbs. But for most women, the best treatment was just more bloodletting. There were various instruments designed to suck the bad blood out of a woman's body, including one particularly gruesome device that looked like a suction cup but had sharp metal teeth. Cups were also popular since placing them on the abdomen was believed to draw out the offending fluids. But cups could leave nasty scars. And one doctor recommended drawing a design on the cup to distract the patient from its looks. Guess that's one way to take your mind off the pain. Given all these hardships, it's no surprise that women held on to their menstrual knowledge fiercely. They developed networks to share supplies and information. And some women like Trota of Bologna in the 12th century even wrote treatises on women's health, complete with advice on treating painful periods. Their work saved countless lives and paved the way for modern gynecology. But it wasn't until the 19th century that women started gaining control over their own bodies again, thanks to affordable and accessible sanitary products. The struggle for reproductive rights is far from over, but we can all agree that things are a whole lot less messy now. It's me, and remember, don't pop painkillers before that first cup of coffee. Welcome back to the channel. Today we're answering another viewer question. This question comes from a viewer. What did medieval women use as toilet paper? Viewer, you are about to get an education. First off, there was no such thing as toilet paper in the Middle Ages. No one had invented it yet. So what did medieval women use after they relieved themselves of their bodily functions? Let's just say anything and everything went. I guess this is a good time to mention that the word woman in the 14th century could refer to a female human being of any age. So when I say women, I do mean girls too. But I digress. The options available to medieval women were straw, moss, or hay, a corner of their dress, and if they were lucky, a piece of wool cloth. If they were very lucky, the woman had a small stash of linen or hempen cloth that she used for nothing else. The linen or hempen cloth would have been a luxury item and therefore quite expensive. It makes sense that a woman wouldn't want to use her precious cloths for cleaning purposes only, especially since clothing was also used as toilet paper. That means the garment would need to be laundered. Laundering clothes in the Middle Ages meant more than just throwing them in a washing machine. It was a full day's work. First, the clothes had to be soaked overnight in a big tub with stale urine. Urine was excellent for removing stains and dirt. Then the clothes were beaten against a stone slab or a large rock until dry. Beating the clothes with a wooden mallet or a heavy stick was also an option. Next, the garments were rinsed, sometimes with vinegar, and then put into a drying room. There weren't many drying rooms in the Middle Ages. Most people lived in drafty stone houses with thatched roofs. The thatch made excellent makeshift drying rooms. Clotheslines were used, but the garments were usually hung outside. Wind and sun were the ultimate clothing dryers. All in all, this was a long and tedious process. So women tried to avoid laundering their clothes as much as possible. They might have used the same cloth for several years, even if it was rather smelly by then. In urban areas, women had the option of using public latrines, which were usually attached to taverns and alehouses. These places were frequented by both men and women, so it makes sense that there were public toilets nearby. Sharing was the name of the game here. If a woman were to travel with a piece of cloth, she could use it for cleaning herself after using the latrine. But then she'd have to find someone to take it off of her hands. The problem with public latrines is that, well, they were public. There was no such thing as privacy in the Middle Ages. In fact, people took great delight in eavesdropping on others. If a woman wanted to use the public latrine without an audience, she'd have to choose one that was far away from prying ears. In rural areas, women had no choice but to go behind a barn, near the stream that they also used for drinking water, or in a hole in the floor called a garderobe. Behind a barn or near the stream was pretty private, but the hole in the floor was often a busy thoroughfare. The garderobe was usually located in the main hall of a house. The family would simply drop their business into the hole and then continue on with their day. If you were a guest in someone's home, you had no choice but to use the garderobe too. It was right there in the middle of the floor. If it was a busy household, you could end up sharing the experience with a pig or a cow. Sometimes the contents of the garderobe would make its way into a nearby river or stream. Since people also dumped their garbage in the river, it wasn't uncommon for fish to be covered in human excrement. Yum, if a woman were to relieve herself in a garderobe, she would have to clean herself with whatever she had on her person, which likely wasn't a clean cloth. She might have used a bit of straw or hay or perhaps a leaf or some moss. After using the garderobe, the absolute best thing she could hope for was a quick rinse with vinegar or cold water. In conclusion, medieval women used whatever they could find as toilet paper. In order to answer this question, I had to do a lot of research, and I am now asking you to do me a favor. Click that like button and subscribe to my channel. As always, thanks for watching. Bye. Those with crooked yellow teeth were mocked mercilessly in the 14th century. A smile could strike fear into people's hearts. Today, we think a nice smile is a beautiful thing, but back then, not so much. In fact, it was downright terrifying. There are many reasons for this. For example, brushing your teeth. Yeah, that thing that you do every day, that thing that helps prevent cavities and bad breath, that thing that requires almost no effort, didn't exist in the Middle Ages. The toothbrush wasn't invented until the 15th century, and even then it was just a twig. And as for toothpaste, well, let's just say it was both hilarious and disgusting. One of the most popular brands, or maybe it was just the only one, was called Unicorn's Milk. It consisted of equal parts pig fat and ground-up eggshells, lovely. Other recipes included ground-up mice. Arsenic and red lead, which is to say nothing of actual unicorn horn. Now, to be fair, some of these ingredients had some mild cleaning properties, but that was about it. As far as fighting cavities, preventing gum disease, or making your breath smell nice, they did none of that. For those who couldn't afford pig fat toothpaste, there were plenty of other options. Some women cleaned their mouths with cloths dipped in wine or vinegar. Others used crushed charcoal, herbs, or even ground animal bones. Still, others opted for a gritty powder made from the ashes of burnt snails. Yes, really. Then there were the barbers, and I use that word loosely here because in the Middle Ages, barbers weren't necessarily men who cut hair. They were more like general handymen. Many blacksmiths and shoemakers also doubled as barbers. And what qualifications do you need to pull teeth? Clearly, none. This was a job for the lowest common denominator, kind of like medieval society's version of a food truck. Anything goes. These days, if you go to the dentist and they offer you a choice between a filling and having the tooth pulled, you probably know which option you want. But in the Middle Ages, dental care was so bad, yanking a tooth was sometimes preferable to a filling. Of course, that was only if you could afford not to have a tooth. Cavities were incredibly common. In fact, they were practically the norm. One study found that 27% of medieval skeletons had signs of tooth decay, while another study found that 80% of medieval skeletons had lost at least one tooth. And a third found that 40% of medieval skeletons had abscesses on their gums. You gotta love the good old days. If a tooth hurt, it was yanked out immediately. Usually it was done by someone who also pulled horseshoes, set broken bones, and dressed wounds. No anesthesia was used, so patients were held down, usually by an assistant, while the barber pulled away. All the patient had were a few prayers and maybe a small bowl of water in case things got a little dry. The worst part is that women were expected to keep smiling throughout the whole thing. Women's teeth were considered a sign of their beauty, so they couldn't be seen crying or wincing. In fact, a woman's rotten teeth might actually have been considered attractive. After all, it was thought that black, rotting teeth made a woman look mysterious and exotic. And what about bad breath? I mean, you can't talk sweet nothings when you reek of, well, everything. Surprisingly, medieval breath wasn't necessarily considered bad. That is, unless you were a woman. See, women's mouths were supposed to smell like roses or lilac. Men's mouths, on the other hand, were expected to smell like, well, anything. After all, men spent their days working up a sweat and their evenings drinking stale urine. A stinky man was a normal man. A stinky woman was an offensive woman. As gross as it all sounds, modern dentistry really has come a long way. No more pig-fat toothpaste, no more horse. Chewers pulling teeth, no more misaligned bites caused by poorly fitted dentures, and for that we should all be thankful. So next time you re-sitting in the dentist's chair and he or she lectures you about plaque or flossing or some other chore, just remember, at least I'm not swishing pig-fat toothpaste in a drafty stone hut. Thank you for watching and see you next time. When you think of life in the Middle Ages, what comes to mind? Perhaps valiant knights clad in shining armor, dashing through the countryside on noble steeds, or maybe you're thinking about dark dungeons where the only sounds were the dripping of water and the wails of prisoners. Maybe you're thinking about the bubonic plague. Well, today we're going to talk about something different, something that's often overlooked in medieval studies, and that is the fashion of the time. More specifically, we'll be talking about one aspect of fashion that never really goes out of style, your clothes. Now, if you've ever spent much time thinking about how often you wash your clothes, go ahead and stop thinking about that now because it's disgusting. We wash our clothes pretty frequently, don't we? Like once a week or maybe even more often if you do a lot of manual labor. But that's not nearly as often as people in the Middle Ages would wash their clothes. In fact, during the Middle Ages, it was quite rare for an article of clothing to be washed more than 4 times per year. For most people, laundry day was no more frequent than once a season, although some slightly wealthier folk might manage to get their duds cleaned twice a year. But for the vast majority of medieval men and women, they were wearing the same clothes day after day, week after week, month after month. For those of us who have ever had the misfortune of wearing the same clothes for more than a couple of days, we know that eventually you start to feel a little bit gross. But imagine how these people felt, wearing the same clothes for literal months at a time. They didn't have the same access to basic hygiene products that we do today, like soap, shampoo, toothpaste, deodorant. So it makes sense that they would wear the same set of clothes until they absolutely had to wash them. But how often does it take before a set of clothes needs to be washed? Let's take a look at the typical medieval outfit, starting with the underclothes. Most people, both male and female, wore a simple linen shirt as a base layer. This would soak up their sweat, helping to keep their outer clothes cleaner for longer. But that doesn't mean they didn't stink. These undergarments were rarely washed, sometimes not at all, which means that this base layer would often be the smelliest part of a medieval person's wardrobe. Some wealthier folks might wear a smock over their shirt while working, but this too would go unwashed unless one was lucky enough to have a domestic servant who could help out with laundry. For women specifically, there was also the kirtle, which was a dress that reached down to the ankles and was made from wool or linen. Wealthier women might also wear a corset over their kirtle to make their waist appear smaller. These dresses had many layers, which might include a petticoat, a bum pad, and a farthingale. All of these items were designed to give the wearer a very specific silhouette. But hygiene was not on the list of things they were designed for. These clothes were expensive, not just because of the cost of the fabric, but because of the countless hours it took to produce them. That meant that they needed to last as long as possible, which they did, whether the wearer wanted them to or not. Women in particular took great pains to preserve the appearance of their clothing because it was a sign of their beauty and femininity, so they'd often choose to air out their clothes rather than wash them. They'd brush off any excess dirt and grime and then hang their clothes outside to freshen up. Washing clothes was not just inconvenient, it was hard work. It required hauling water, boiling it, scrubbing with lye, which by the way could burn your skin if you're not careful, then letting the clothes dry for days. It was a lot of effort for something that was essentially pointless. I mean, you're just gonna get dirty again, aren't you? One thing's for sure, though. If you found yourself face to face with a medieval person who hadn't bathed in months, you probably wouldn't want to stand downwind of them. Between the lack of bathing, the stale waste, and the manure used for cleaning, medieval people smelled like, well, you can imagine. To combat this, many garments had a small pouch sewn into them where the wearer could place fragrant materials like rose petals, lavender, or even cinnamon bark. But how effective were these makeshift air fresheners? Probably not very. Imagine the smell of roses mixed with the stench of stale sweat and dirt. Yeah, I don't either. One last thing, because this is something that medieval people dealt with all the time, menstruation stains were very common. There was no such thing as feminine hygiene products back then, so women had to use whatever they had on hand to make do. As you can imagine, this led to some pretty pungent smells. So there you have it, a quick glimpse into the smelly world of medieval fashion. Did you learn anything new? Surprised by anything? Let us know in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching. Hey, guys, when you can't clean yourself, just drown in roses and pretend. In our modern world, we are obsessed with cleanliness and hygiene. I mean, look at all the soap commercials during football games. If you don't shower regularly, you might get some strange looks and comments from your friends and family. And if you show up somewhere that requires a shower and you smell bad, you might be asked to leave. But believe it or not, there was a time when people thought it was perfectly fine to smell bad. Our next video will be on when anal bleaching was a thing, so make sure you subscribe so you don't miss out. In the meantime, here are some interesting facts about bad hygiene throughout history. By the late Middle Ages, perfuming became the last resort of women who knew they stank, but didn't want to be socially dead. Lavender oil, rosewater, musk, and herbs were dabbed on wrists, necks, and dresses. Some even stuffed flowers into their undergarments, yes, flower-scented underwear before it was cool. But this practice had less to do with pleasant aromas and everything to do with covering up the lack of basic hygiene. Wealthier women carried pomanders, tiny metal balls filled with spices and resins. They would hold them to their noses in church or crowded streets to avoid the collective stink of humanity. Perfumes were made of expensive ingredients and were considered a luxury item. They were also used as a form of seduction and as a way to make a good impression. In fact, during the Renaissance, it was common for wealthy men to have their own personal perfumer who would create custom scents for them. But let's be clear, perfume did not mean clean. It was camouflage for rot, sweat, and bacteria. Sometimes the perfume just mixed with the body odor, creating an even more horrifying scent. It wasn't just the poor or the uneducated who smelled bad either. Even the richest and most powerful people in the world had their share of stinky problems. King Louis XIV of France, known for his lavish lifestyle and numerous mistresses, reportedly smelled so bad that his courtiers had to wear masks to cover their noses. And despite the fact that Queen Elizabeth I of England was known for her love of perfume, she too had a rather unpleasant odor. Despite all the perfume in the world, it couldn't mask the stench of stale waste and chamber pots. In fact, chamber pots were often kept near entrances so that people could relieve themselves before leaving the house. Talk about a welcoming committee, and don't forget about the animals. Dogs, cats, livestock, and even vermin were all part of daily life in the medieval world, and they all added their own special aroma to the mix. And it wasn't just the smells that were off-putting. People in the Middle Ages were also very familiar with the sight of rotting flesh and the sound of flies buzzing around. In a time when medical knowledge was limited, people were often unable to prevent their wounds from becoming infected and gangrenous. And even if they did everything right, there was no guarantee that they would survive childbirth. Death was a constant presence in medieval life, and people were exposed to it from a very young age. Children were often buried in the same coffins as their parents, and it was not uncommon for families to live in the same house for several generations. This meant that people were constantly surrounded by the dead and the dying, and it was impossible to escape the reality of mortality. But it wasn't all bad. There were also plenty of reasons to celebrate in the Middle Ages. People enjoyed feasting, dancing, and making merry, and they were not afraid to show their joy. Of course, they weren't doing it in the middle of a graveyard, but they were doing it in spite of the fact that there was a lot of death around. So while it's safe to say that the Middle Ages were not the best time to be alive if you were a hygiene fanatic, it was still possible to find joy and happiness even in the midst of death and decay. If you like this video, check out more facts about the Middle Ages, and let us know in the comments below if there's a particular time period you'd like us to cover next.